The morning of the settlement meeting, I wore my mother's pearl earrings. Not for luck, not to look nice. I wore them because my brother had already sold everything else she'd left me, and I wanted something of hers in that room when it all finally came apart. Let me back up. My mom died 14 months before that meeting. Ovarian cancer, stage 4, diagnosed in March and gone by October. Those 7 months were the longest and shortest of my life. I moved back into the house I grew up in, a 3-bedroom colonial in Dayton, Ohio, to help with her care. My brother, who lived 40 minutes away in Columbus, came by maybe 6 times total. I counted. 6 visits in 7 months, and 3 of those were on holidays when he would have driven down anyway. My name is not important for this story. What's important is that I'm 31 years old, I have a background in bookkeeping, and I have a very, very hard time letting things go when the numbers don't add up. My brother's name is Wesley. He is 38. He sells commercial real estate, and he has always believed on some deep, unexamined level that he deserves more than the people around him. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's the only way to explain what he did, and the only way to explain why he thought he would get away with it. Mom updated her will 6 weeks before she died. She was still lucid, still sharp, still the woman who could do the Sunday crossword in pen. She told me she was splitting everything equally: the house, the savings, the small brokerage account she'd built over 30 years of teaching middle school math. Half to me, half to me, half to Wesley. She also told me she was naming Wesley as executor because, she said, he was older and she didn't want me to have to deal with the paperwork on top of the grief. I told her that was fine. I meant it. What I didn't know was that Wesley had spent the previous 2 years quietly drowning. His brokerage had tanked after he lost a major client. He'd taken out a second mortgage on his condo without telling his wife. He owed back taxes, federal, not just state, going back to 2022. I didn't know any of this. Mom didn't know any of this. He was very good at performing stability. She passed on a Tuesday in early October. I held her hand. Wesley got there 40 minutes later and stood in the doorway of her room looking at the floor. The funeral was handled, the obituary written, the casseroles accepted and returned. And then Wesley became executor, and things started to feel wrong in ways I couldn't immediately name. The first thing I noticed was the house going on the market without my signature. He called me on a Wednesday. I remember because I was at my desk, reconciling invoices for the small dental practice where I worked, and told me he'd already spoken to a realtor. Listed it at $287,000. I told him I hadn't agreed to sell. He said that as executor, he had the authority to manage estate assets and that the house needed to be liquidated to settle debts. What debts? I asked. Estate expenses, he said. Attorney fees, the funeral balance, property taxes. That made sense on its face. I let it go. I told myself he was handling it, that this was what executors did. The house sold in 3 weeks. I signed the closing documents because at that point, I was still operating under the assumption that Wesley was doing his job. I was also operating under the assumption that we would split the proceeds. We did not. He told me the net after estate expenses was $14,200, and he cut me a check for $7,100. The house had sold for $287,000. I sat with that for 2 days. Then I got out a legal pad and started doing the math. Property taxes on that house ran about $3,800 a year, and they were current. Mom had always paid on time. The funeral had cost $9,400, and I had the receipt because I'd been the one to make the arrangements. The estate attorney, a man named Mr. Calloway, who had a small office on Salem Avenue, had charged $2,500 for probate filing. I knew that because I'd been CC'd on one email early on before Wesley quietly removed me from the thread. So the legitimate deductions were somewhere around $16,000 at the absolute outside. On a $287,000 sale, that left $271,000. Half of that was $135,500. He had sent me $7,100. I called him. He didn't answer. I texted him the breakdown. He texted back, there were additional expenses. I'll send you a full accounting. He never sent a full accounting. 3 weeks passed. I called Mr. Dollar, Calloway's office, and asked for a copy of the estate inventory. The receptionist was polite and confused in equal measure. She said the file had been closed and that Wesley had picked up the original documents. She said she could send me a copy of the probate filing, which was public record. The probate filing listed the estate value at $312,000, which included the house, Mom's savings account, $21,400, and the brokerage account $3,600. It listed total estate debts at $294,000. I read that number 3 times. $294,800 in debts. For a woman who had driven the same Honda Civic for 11 years and packed her lunch every day of her working life, I asked the receptionist if there was an itemized debt schedule attached. She said yes, and she read it to me over the phone because I think she could hear something in my voice that made her feel like she should. The itemized debts included $187,000 listed as a personal loan repayment owed to Wesley Hartwell. Wesley Hartwell is my brother. He had filed paperwork claiming that our mother owed him $187,000, which conveniently consumed almost the entire estate before I could receive my share. No loan agreement was attached. No promissory note. Just a number and a name. I hung up the phone. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I opened my laptop and started writing everything down. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't what you might expect. I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage exactly. What I felt was a cold, clarifying stillness. The same feeling I get when I find an error in a ledger and suddenly understand where every cent went. The situation became, in that moment, very simple. He had stolen from our mother's estate. He had stolen from me, and he had been sloppy about it. That last part mattered. My background is bookkeeping. I am not a lawyer. I am not a forensic accountant. But I know how money moves, and I know that money always leaves a trail, and I know that people who steal from people they consider less powerful than themselves tend to get careless in ways that careful people don't. The next morning, I drove to the county probate court and requested the full public file on my mother's estate. It cost me $14 in copying fees. I sat in my car in the parking lot and read through every page. The so-called loan had no documentation. The estate filing was signed by Wesley and notarized, but there was no attached agreement, no repayment schedule, no evidence of funds actually transferred. I had also found, in my mother's papers, which I had kept because I was the one who cleared the house, 12 years of her bank statements. Wesley's name did not appear as a source of any deposit. Not once. He hadn't loaned her money. He had invented a debt to steal her estate. I also found something else in those bank statements. Beginning 14 months before she died, right around when she was diagnosed, there were monthly transfers of $1,200 going to an account I didn't recognize. They continued until 2 months before her death when they stopped. 18 months, $1,200 a month, $21,600 total, almost exactly the amount in her savings account. I wrote the account number down on a post-it note and stuck it to my dashboard. Here is where I need to tell you about the morning of the settlement meeting, because that's where this story has its turn. The meeting had been called because I had hired an attorney, a woman named Miss Park, who practiced estate litigation out of a small firm in downtown Dayton. I found her through the Ohio State Bar website after searching specifically for attorneys who handled executor misconduct. Her consultation fee was $200, which I paid out of my grocery budget for that month. Ms. Park reviewed the probate file, my mother's bank statements, and the documentation I'd compiled. She was quiet for a long time after she finished reading. Then she said, "This is not subtle." She sent Wesley a formal demand letter. He responded through his own attorney, a man I'll call by his role, his lawyer, who had an office in a glass building downtown and who, I learned later, had a side business helping certain clients structure asset transfers in creative ways. The response letter was aggressive. It accused me of harassing the executor, misunderstanding estate law, and attempting to relitigate a properly closed probate proceeding. Miscation. Park read it and said, "He's scared. The settlement meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at 9 in the morning at a neutral location, a conference room at a title company near the courthouse. Miss Tao, Park told me to dress professionally, bring nothing except what she told me to bring, and under no circumstances to speak unless she nodded at me first. I left my apartment at 8:15. I was wearing a blazer I'd bought at Target 3 years earlier, my mother's pearl earrings, and shoes that were slightly too tight because I'd worn them maybe 4 times in my life and never for longer than 2 hours. I took the long way downtown because I needed the extra minutes. I was walking from the parking garage, about a block and a half from the title company, when I almost walked into a man sitting in a wheelchair near the curb outside a coffee shop. He was older, I'd guess late 70s, maybe 80. He had a paper coffee cup balanced on his knee, and he was reading something on his phone, squinting at it in a way that made me think he probably needed stronger glasses. He dropped his cane, which was lying on the sidewalk just out of reach. I picked it up and handed it to him. He looked up and said, "Thank you. I've been waiting for someone who is paying attention." I said something like, "Of course," and I was already starting to move on when he said, "You look like you're walking into something difficult." I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe because he said it matter-of-factly, not as small talk. Maybe because I was about to walk into the hardest meeting of my life and I hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks. I said. "Where are you headed?" I told him. "The title company, a settlement meeting, estate litigation." He nodded slowly and said, "I happen to know that building. I actually have somewhere to be in that same direction if you don't mind pushing this thing." I looked at my watch. I had 11 minutes. I said, "I don't mind at all." We walked, I pushed about half a block in comfortable silence. He asked me what the dispute was about. I gave him the short version. The phantom loan. The missing money. The brother who had decided that executor meant owner. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When I finished, he said, "Did your attorney file a complaint with the probate court or just a civil demand?" I looked down at him. "Both, actually." "Why?" He said. "Good. The civil track is slower. The probate violation is what creates real exposure." I said, "Are you a lawyer?" He smiled and said, "Retired. Mostly." We reached the title company. I held the door open. He maneuvered inside, and I assumed he was heading to a different suite, a different meeting, a different piece of someone else's complicated life. He was not. He rolled into the same elevator I stepped into. He got out on the same floor. He moved toward the same conference room. When the door opened, my brother was already seated at the far end of the table, his attorney beside him, both of them looking polished and unbothered in the way that people look when they believe they've already won. Wesley looked at me. Then he looked at the man in the wheelchair. Something crossed his face. I watched it happen, like a cloud moving over still water. His attorney looked over too, and whatever he saw made him sit up straighter. The man in the wheelchair rolled to the head of the table and set his coffee cup down. "Miss Murray." Park leaned over to me and said, very quietly, "Do you know who that is?" I shook my head. She said, "That's Judge Harold Finch. He's the retired chief of the probate division for Montgomery County. He volunteers with the Ohio State Bar's Estate Fraud Task Force." I sat down slowly. Judge Finch looked at Wesley's attorney and said, in the pleasant tone of a man who had presided over thousands of difficult conversations and found most of them manageable, "Counselor, I've read the public filing on this estate. I have some questions. What happened next took about 40 minutes, and I want to be precise because the details matter." Wesley's attorney attempted in the first 5 minutes to establish that Judge Finch had no standing in the room. Judge Finch agreed pleasantly that he had no formal standing and said he was happy to leave if everyone preferred. Miss Park said she'd like him to stay. I said I'd like him to stay. Wesley's attorney looked at Wesley. Wesley looked at the table. Judge Finch asked about the $187,000 loan. Wesley's attorney said it was a documented personal loan made over several years in cash and personal assistance. Judge Finch asked for the documentation. Wesley's attorney said it was proprietary to the estate and that the estate was closed. Judge Finch said that probate filings in Ohio are public record and that the documentation should therefore be available, and he would be happy to request it formally through the task force if that was preferred. Wesley's attorney asked for a 10-minute recess. During those 10 minutes, I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at my mother's earrings reflected in the glass of the window across from me. Miss Park refilled her water glass. Judge Finch read something on his phone. When they came back, Wesley's attorney said that his client was prepared to discuss a revised accounting of estate assets. Judge Finch said, "I think that would be wise." The revised accounting took 3 more weeks and 2 more meetings to finalize. What it revealed was this. Wesley had transferred $21,600 from my mother's savings account to a personal account over 18 months, the exact transfers I'd found in her bank statements. He had listed those transfers retroactively as loan repayments. He had also charged the estate $43,000 in executor compensation, which in Ohio is calculated as a percentage of the estate value and must be approved by the probate court, which it had not been. The $187,000 loan had no documentation because no loan had ever existed. The estate attorney, Mr. Calloway, had signed the filing without, he claimed, understanding the full implications. He later cooperated with the Bar Association investigation in exchange for a reduced disciplinary proceeding. The account that had received my mother's $1,200 monthly transfers turned out to be a business account for a rental property Wesley owned in his wife's name. He had told my mother, according to text messages she had saved and that I found on her old iPad, which I had kept because I couldn't bring myself to erase it, that the transfers were helping him stay afloat while he sorted out the brokerage situation. She had been quietly helping her son for a year and a half, saying nothing to me because she didn't want to cause conflict. She had kept giving to him until she didn't have enough strength left to stop him. I don't talk about that part without my voice doing something I can't control. So, I'll just move on. Wesley did not go to prison, which I want to be honest about because I know that's what people want to hear. What happened was this. He entered into a civil settlement that required him to repay the estate $148,000, the unauthorized compensation, the misappropriated transfers, and a negotiated portion of the phantom loan. He was removed as executor, which didn't matter because the estate was nearly resolved. The Ohio State Bar opened a formal investigation into his attorney's role in structuring the filing. My share of the estate, once properly calculated, came to $79,400. That included the corrected split of the house proceeds, the savings account, and the brokerage. It was not a fortune. It was what my mother had worked for over 3 decades of grading papers and showing up. I paid off the credit card debt I'd accumulated during the 14 months I spent caring for her. I set aside 3 months of expenses. I put the rest in an index fund because that is what she would have done. The pearl earrings are in a small dish on my bathroom counter. I wear them sometimes. I think about the morning I found Judge Finch on that sidewalk more than I probably should. I've turned it over in my mind from different angles. The simplest version is the truest one. I was paying attention. He dropped his cane. I picked it up. That's it. There's no cosmic machinery in it. He happened to be on his way to the same building I was. He happened to have spent 40 years in probate law. He happened to be the kind of man who, when confronted with something that looked like fraud in a public filing, chose to ask questions rather than look away. What I've learned from the whole thing is simpler than I expected it to be. My brother believed that I was softer than him, less savvy, easier to overwhelm. He was right that I was quieter. He was wrong about what that meant. I didn't confront him at every turn because I was waiting. I was watching. I was writing things down. I was building a picture that didn't lie. He had 7 months to witness what I did for our mother. Every appointment, every medication schedule, every night I slept on her floor when the pain was bad, and he decided what it meant was that I could be taken advantage of. He found out what it actually meant about 2 seconds after Judge Finch set his coffee cup on that conference table. People who do the least always assume they can take the most. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's guilt running backward into entitlement. Maybe it's something simpler and uglier than that. What I know is that the numbers never lie. The paper trail is always there, and the person in the wheelchair you almost step over on your way to the most important meeting of your life might be the exact person you needed to meet. I still work in bookkeeping. I still find errors in ledgers for a living. I'm better at it now than I was before all of this, which I didn't think was possible. And if you have a sibling who's been given control of something that matters, a parent's care, a family account, an estate, and something in the numbers doesn't feel right, write it down. All of it. Don't make accusations. Don't send the angry texts. Just write it down, find the right person to help you read it, and let the math do what it does. It always adds up eventually. I've thought a lot about why Wesley did what he did. Not to excuse it, there's no version of this where fabricating a $187,000 debt against her own mother's estate becomes understandable, but because I think understanding it matters. He was drowning and he chose, very deliberately, to drown her too. He looked at a woman who had spent her entire life showing up for other people and decided that made her a resource rather than a person. That's not a financial crime at its root. That's a failure of character that went completely unchecked for years, probably decades, because nobody ever made him face a real consequence. I'm not a moralist. I don't stand on corners with signs. But I do believe, very plainly, that the way you behave when nobody is watching, when the person you're taking from is too sick to notice, when the paperwork is complicated enough that most people won't read it, when you've calculated that your sister is too soft to fight back, that is who you actually are. Not the version you perform at Thanksgiving. Not the version that posts things on social media. The version that moves $1,200 a month out of a dying woman's savings account and calls it a loan repayment. Wesley made one fundamental error. He mistook my quietness for weakness. He saw me spending 14 months managing medication schedules and sleeping on mom's floor, and he read it as submission. He thought people who take care of others do it because they can't do anything harder. He was wrong about that in a way that cost him $148,000 and his professional reputation, and I want to say clearly, I did not set out to destroy him. I set out to understand what happened to the money. The destruction was entirely his own work. I just documented it. What I keep coming back to is this. Integrity isn't something you have in the easy moments. It's something you either build or erode in the invisible ones, when you could take the shortcut, when you could look the other way, when you could tell yourself a story about why you deserve more than you've earned. Wesley had been eroding his for a long time before our mother got sick. I think some part of him knew it. I think that's why he couldn't look at me directly in that conference room. Not because he was caught, but because I had been present for everything he had avoided, and my being there made the contrast impossible to ignore. I also think about Judge Finch more than I probably should. He didn't have to stop and talk to me. He didn't have to ask where I was headed. He was a retired man with a coffee cup and a dropped cane and nowhere he urgently needed to be. But he was curious, and he was paying attention, and he had spent 40 years developing expertise that he chose to keep using after he was no longer required to. That kind of person exists because they made thousands of small decisions to stay engaged, stay sharp, stay useful, not for recognition, but because it was the right way to spend a life. I want to be that kind of person. I'm working on it. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from all of this, it's simpler than it sounds. Pay attention, write things down, and don't let someone else's confidence convince you that you're wrong when the numbers say otherwise. Dishonesty depends on confusion. It needs you to feel overwhelmed, outmatched, like the paperwork is too complicated for someone like you. The moment you decide to understand it anyway, to sit in a parking lot and read every page, to call the court clerk, to find the right person and ask the right questions, that's when it stops having power over you. My mother spent 30 years teaching 12-year-olds that math wasn't something to be afraid of. She taught them that if you work through it carefully, it always makes sense in the end. She was right about that. She was right about most things.